Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about two brothers in a roadside tavern where the darkest secrets were served alongside whiskey that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. How does a life, a universe of thoughts, dreams, and memories, simply cease to exist? How does a future so vividly imagined and brimming with promise vanish into the shimmering heat rising from a lonely stretch of asphalt? These are the questions that echo from the forgotten corners of the past, from stories buried so deep beneath the soil of time that their whispers are nearly indistinguishable from the wind. But they are never truly gone. They wait, patiently, sometimes for decades, for the one person who will care enough to listen, to dig through the layers of silence, and finally bring the truth into the light. Our story begins in the suffocating heat of the summer of 1981, a season that seemed to press down on the small, isolated town of Pinewood Creek, Oregon, with a tangible weight. It was a place nestled deep within the pine-covered foothills of the Cascade Range, a community bound by shared histories and a quiet, almost suspicious, view of the outside world. Here, strangers were few, and the rhythms of life were as predictable as the rising sun over the eastern ridges. July 15 was a Wednesday, the kind of blistering day where the temperature pushed 90 degrees by noon, causing the asphalt on Main Street to soften into a black, shimmering ribbon that smelled of tar and dust. On that deceptively ordinary afternoon, 22-year-old Jessica Harmon, her diploma from Portland State still smelling of fresh ink, was embarking on a small, celebratory adventure. Her brown hair was feathered back in the iconic style of the era, and her spirit was as bright and hopeful as the butter-yellow Ford Pinto she drove. The car was a symbol of freedom, a quirky, imperfect vessel that backfired when pushed past 50 miles per hour, but one that held all her worldly possessions and the boundless aspirations of youth. Jessica's dreams stretched far beyond the confines of Pinewood Creek's sleepy Main Street. She spoke with a quiet passion about joining the Peace Corps, of trading the familiar scent of pine for the exotic air of places that, until then, had only existed for her in the glossy, vibrant pages of her treasured National Geographic collection. She wanted to teach children, to see the world, to make a mark. But first, she had made a promise. She had promised her widowed mother, Ellen, one last carefree summer at home before she spread her wings. That Wednesday, with the rebellious energy of Blondie's Call Me pulsing from the car radio, she gave her mother a final, lingering hug on the porch. She was heading up to Silver Lake for a weekend camping trip with friends from college, a last taste of youthful abandon. The drive was a familiar one, a 30-mile ribbon of asphalt that wound its way past quiet farms and into the dense, imposing forests that blanketed the mountains. "I'll call you from the campsite payphone when I get there," she promised, the sound of quarters jingling in her pocket a cheerful, metallic punctuation to her words. "Should be around 6 or 7, depending on traffic." Ellen Harmon would later recall that final moment, replaying it in her mind thousands of times with the haunting, frame-by-frame clarity that only profound grief can bestow upon memory. She remembered the precise way the afternoon sunlight caught the turquoise threads of a friendship bracelet on Jessica's wrist as she waved goodbye. She remembered the faint, muffled sound of a Fleetwood Mac 8-track tape rumors playing in the car, a soundtrack to a future that would never arrive. She remembered her final words, a mother's gentle plea that would become a heartbreaking epitaph. The world needs teachers like you. Jess, come back safe. But Jessica Harmon never called from the campsite payphone. She never laughed around a campfire at Silver Lake. She and her butter yellow Pinto drove into the heart of the Oregon wilderness and simply vanished, becoming another smiling face on a missing person poster, another thick file folder in a cold metal cabinet that would, for many, many years, gather dust. What happened to her on that summer afternoon would remain a question hanging in the suffocating heat, a mystery that would fester for nearly 4 decades in the long, dark shadow of a place that watched everyone pass by. The answer to that question, the terrible, unspoken truth, would lie dormant, buried deep within the rotting foundations of an establishment that sat alone at the junction of Highway 27 and the old, disused logging road, the Crossroads Tavern. This was no welcoming roadside inn. The tavern was a weary, weathered wooden structure that seemed to sag under the weight of unspoken history. Its gravel parking lot, often populated by massive logging trucks and the mud-splattered pickups of local laborers, was a temporary stage for men who carried the scent of sawdust and quiet desperation. It was a place of profound isolation, a last outpost at the edge of the wilderness where the deep, ancient woods began and the rules of civilization started to fray. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. The air was a thick, stagnant cocktail of stale beer, old cigarette smoke, and something else, an undercurrent of quiet, watchful tension. A neon Budweiser sign in the window cast a weak, sickly red glow over the dim interior, illuminating dust motes dancing in the gloom. It was a monument to a forgotten time, a place that operated on a cash-only basis, where the country music drifting from a Panasonic radio was always kept low, and the questions were few, if any. This was a place for forgetting, not for asking. Presiding over this silent morose kingdom were the Blackwood brothers, Raymond and Edgar. They were as much a fixture of the tavern as the deeply scarred wooden bar itself. Raymond, the elder by 3 years, was a broad-shouldered man with a receding hairline and a carefully trimmed beard that did little to soften the chilling stillness in his eyes. A veteran of the Vietnam War, he carried the conflict back with him not in stories of valor or camaraderie, but in a brooding, volatile silence that could erupt into shocking violence with little provocation. His past was a tapestry of hushed-up incidents, bar fights that ended with men hospitalized, a temper that ran dangerously hot, and a 6-month stint in the county jail that the locals had long learned never to mention. He moved with the predator's economy of motion, his presence filling the room with a palpable sense of menace. Edgar was his brother's perpetual shadow, leaner, clean-shaven, and marked by a permanent, unsettling squint in his right eye from a long-ago childhood accident. He was the more approachable of the two. Yet, his quick, practiced smile never managed to reach his eyes, making it more of a mask than an expression of warmth. While Raymond managed the tavern's books with a grim, silent intensity in the back office, Edgar managed the customers out front. His movements were deliberate and subservient, always seeming to orbit his older brother's silent authority. He was the buffer, the public face of their grim enterprise. They were an unsettling duo, two halves of a dark, unspoken secret. The tavern, a fortress of silence where weary travelers could find a stiff drink, but never, ever, any answers. It was the last landmark on the road to Silver Lake. the final waypoint before the highway climbed into the deep, unforgiving woods. It was the last place on earth that could have seen Jessica Harmon. As the sun finally bled out behind the Oregon pines on that July evening, the oppressive silence of the tavern stood in stark, cruel contrast to the rising tide of panic in Ellen Harmon's small ranch-style home. The hands on the kitchen clock seemed to mock her, moving with an agonizing slowness. 9 o'clock came and went. No call. Her fingers, trembling with a fear that was beginning to crystallize into certainty, dialed the numbers of Jessica's friends, each brief. Confused conversation was a fresh stab of terror. None had seen her. By 10:30, the house felt cavernous and cold, the silence screaming with her daughter's absence. She contacted the Pinewood Creek Sheriff's Department. The voice on the other end, that of Deputy Jim Rollins, was the calm, patient, and maddeningly procedural voice of a man who had heard 1,000 worried calls. He gently, almost paternally, reminded her that an adult couldn't be officially declared missing until a full 24 hours had passed. She probably just got a flat tire, Ellen, he offered, his voice crackling with static over the line. Or maybe the campsite payphone is out of order. You know how those things are. They break down all the time. But a mother's intuition is a primal, powerful force that defies procedure and protocol. Ellen knew. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was not a flat tire or a broken payphone. This was a nightmare, unfolding in slow motion. By the next morning, her raw, relentless fear had finally infected the quiet sheriff's department, and the official search began. Jessica's recent college graduation photo, a wallet-sized print filled with the incandescent hope and pride of a life just beginning, was placed on the department's new Xerox machine. With each copy, the image degraded, her smile fading, her eyes losing their light, until she was a ghostly echo of the vibrant young woman she had been just a day before. The initial investigation followed a predictable, frustrating path. Deputies in brown uniforms scoured the deep, treacherous ravines along Highway 27. Volunteers, their faces grim, combed the dense forests in long, sweeping lines. Jessica's photocopied face appeared on bulletin boards in the post office and shop windows. A smiling ghost staring out at a community that was slowly, reluctantly, waking up to a horror in their midst. The trail was brief and cruelly clear. A teenage attendant at a Texaco station remembered her stopping for gas, commenting on her happiness. A waitress at Donna's Diner, a few miles further on, recalled her grabbing a quick coffee to go. And then, the trail went cold, utterly and completely. The last confirmed sighting placed her just a few miles from the Crossroads Tavern. Naturally, Sheriff Bill Harding and Deputy Rollins paid the establishment a visit that evening. They found the Blackwood brothers exactly where they always were, standing behind the bar like twin gargoyles guarding a tomb. The lawman presented Jessica's photograph. "Either of you see this girl yesterday afternoon?" Harding asked, his voice cutting through the low hum of Merle Haggard on the tavern's radio. The brothers paused, studying the photograph for a long moment, their expressions unreadable in the dim, smoky light. Edgar was the first to shake his head. "A lot of people pass through here. Sheriff, can't say I recall her, specifically." Raymond, wiping an already clean glass, handed the photograph back, his movements precise and dismissive. "We were busy yesterday," he stated, his tone flat and final, leaving no room for argument. "Logging crew from up north stopped in, got pretty rowdy. If she drove by, we wouldn't have noticed from inside." Their denial was seamless, a practiced, airtight recitation delivered without a single flicker of doubt or hesitation. It was the first stone laid in what would become a 40-year wall of silence. An answer so simple, so plausible, and yet so profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. That simple, unwavering denial hung in the air long after the sheriff's car had pulled away, its effectiveness lying in its sheer, audacious simplicity. For the Pinewood Creek Sheriff's Department, with no body, no vehicle, and no witnesses to contradict the brothers' story, the trail had not just gone cold, it had evaporated into nothingness. The days bled into weeks, and the oppressive heat of summer eventually gave way to the crisp, melancholic air of fall. The search efforts, once a frantic flurry of activity, dwindled to a determined few before ceasing altogether. Jessica's friends, their faces etched with a grief that would soon be tempered by the demands of their own burgeoning lives, returned to their graduate programs and their first teaching jobs. The vibrant, hopeful young woman they knew was now a memory, a ghost that haunted their college reunions. But for Ellen Harmon, time did not heal. It calcified her grief, turning it into a relentless, driving purpose, while life in Pinewood Creek slowly returned to its familiar, placid rhythms. Her world remained frozen on that July afternoon. Jessica's bedroom was left untouched, a perfectly preserved shrine to a life interrupted. The collection of National Geographic magazines remained stacked neatly on her desk, a silent testament to journeys never taken. In the top drawer, a half-completed Peace Corps application lay waiting for a signature that would never come. This room became Ellen's sanctuary and her prisons, a place where hope and despair waged a silent, daily war. Her fight against the creeping apathy of time became a series of quiet, heartbreaking rituals. Every weekend, she would drive to the local library and spend her meager savings photocopying new stacks of missing person flyers. The 25-cent cost of each page, a small price to pay to keep her daughter's face from fading from public consciousness. She would then retrace the route Jessica should have taken that day. Her own car, a somber echo of the yellow Pinto, at gas stations and diners. She would gently take down the sun-bleached, curling images of Jessica and replace them with fresh ones. Her actions a quiet plea against the town's collective amnesia. On the first anniversary of the disappearance, she organized a candlelight vigil at the Pinewood Creek Community Church. Nearly 200 people attended, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering light of white tapers. Their voices joined in a mournful rendition of Amazing Grace that drifted into the summer darkness. "Someone knows something," she told the gathered crowd, her voice steady despite the profound pain in her eyes. "I just want to bring my daughter home." Across town, at the Crossroads Tavern, life continued with an unnerving, almost defiant normalcy. As the Reagan years progressed and America embraced a new era of bold optimism, the case of Jessica Harmon became a relic of a past the town seemed eager to forget. The Blackwood brothers remained a constant, immutable presence. They served whiskey to the steady stream of travelers on Highway 27, their faces betraying nothing. They read the Pinewood Creek Gazette, turning the page without comment whenever Ellen's annual memorial notice appeared, a small, black-bordered square with Jessica's photo and the words "Missing, Not Forgotten." They went fishing on Mondays, their day off, returning with coolers full of trout that Edgar would fry up as the week's special. The passage of years etched new lines on their faces. Raymond developed a paunch, and his temper, once a simmering threat, became a known and feared quantity. Edgar's squint deepened, and a slight stoop began to curve his spine. They were fixtures of the landscape, as permanent and unquestioned as the ancient pine trees that surrounded their property, their terrible secret locked away, undisturbed, behind a facade of mundane routine. With Ellen Harmon's death from a heart attack in 1995, the last persistent voice crying out for justice was silenced. The investigation, already cold for over a decade, froze solid. The thick manila folder containing the sum of Jessica's vanished life was relegated to the department's basement archives, where it sat on a metal shelf, a sleeping monster waiting for a new generation to awaken it. And for nearly 4 decades, it slept. The world outside of Pinewood Creek transformed. The 20th century gave way to the 21st. Technology advanced at a breathtaking pace, creating tools of investigation that the officers of 1981 could scarcely have imagined. And in the spring of 2019, change finally came to the Pinewood Creek Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez, a veteran officer who had worked her way up through the ranks, initiated a comprehensive review of all cold cases. A new unit was formed, a small, 2-person team tasked with peering in the department's darkest, most forgotten corners. They were given a cramped, windowless office in a basement, surrounded by the very archives they were meant to dissect. This unit was led by Detective Marcus Wells, at 42. Wells was a recent transfer from the Seattle Police Department, a specialist in the archaeology of violence. He didn't just look at old files. He saw them as cryptic maps to buried truths. And his reputation for solving long-dormant cases was legendary. His partner was Dr. Leah Chen, a brilliant forensic specialist with a PhD and years of experience at the State Crime Lab. She brought with her the power of modern science, an expertise in DNA analysis and evidence preservation that could give voice to the long dead and the long missing. On a rainy Tuesday in April, their work began. Wells pulled a thick, yellowing manila folder from a metal shelf. The tab, written in faded ink, read, Harmon Jessica, missing July 15th, 81. He laid the contents out on a large metal table, a ghost story told through brittle, typewritten pages. There were the initial incident reports, witness statements captured on an IBM Selectric typewriter, and grainy black and white photographs paper-clipped to interview transcripts. Hand-drawn maps detailed the futile search grids along Highway 27. This one's interesting, Wells murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet basement. 22-year-old female. Disappears on her way to a camping trip. Car never found. It's like she just drove off the face of the earth. Doctor. Chen picked up a degraded photocopy of Jessica's graduation picture. Do we have any physical evidence? She asked. They located the corresponding evidence box, H8115, on a high shelf, sealed with evidence tape that had turned yellow and brittle with age. Inside, carefully preserved in paper bags, were a few precious items: a hairbrush from Jessica's bathroom, fingerprint cards lifted from her bedroom, and soil samples from the initial search area. For the next several weeks, Wells and Chen immersed themselves in the summer of 1981. They digitized the entire file, using software to enhance the faded photographs and transcribe the handwritten notes. From several strands of hair still tangled in the bristles of the brush. Doctor. Chen was able to extract a clean, viable DNA profile for Jessica Harmon, a genetic signature that could now be checked against a national database of unidentified remains. The search came back empty. Then, Wells located the original reporting officer, Jim Rollins, now in his 70s and living in a retirement community near Portland. Though Rollins's memory had softened with age, the Harmon case remained a sharp, unsettling burr in his mind. That one always bothered me, he told Wells, his voice captured on a small, modern digital recorder. We never found a single trace, not a skid mark, not a broken branch. Wells leaned forward. Did you have any suspects, even off the record? Rollins hesitated, his eyes clouding over with the memory. Nothing concrete, but Sheriff Harding. He had a feeling about those Blackwood brothers out at the Crossroads Tavern, said they were hinky, but we never had a damn thing to connect them to the girl. They claimed they never saw her. The name, unspoken for decades within the context of the case, landed with the force of a revelation. Back at the department, Wells ran a background check. The tavern was still there, and one of the brothers, Edgar, was still listed as the owner. "I think we need to take a drive," Wells said to Chen, closing his laptop. The Crossroads Tavern looked much as it had in the old case file photographs, a relic that had stubbornly refused to change with the times. As Wells and Doctor. Chen pulled into the gravel lot in an unmarked SUV. They stepped into a bubble of the past. Inside, the tavern smelled of fried food, old beer, and regret. Behind the bar stood an elderly man with stooped shoulders and a familiar, permanent squint in his right eye. Edgar Blackwood, now 80 years old, still tending bar. Wells and Chen took seats, ordering sodas. After a few minutes of quiet observation, Wells discreetly showed his badge. "Working on an old case from 1,981 inches, he said conversationally. "Young woman disappeared along this highway. Jessica Harmon. I believe the original investigators spoke with you and your brother." Edgar's hand, wiping the bar with a rag, paused for a fraction of a second. It was a momentary hesitation, a barely perceptible glitch in his practiced, deliberate movements. But to a man like Wells, it was as loud as a gunshot. "That was a long time ago," Edgar said finally, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't recall much about it." Wells presented an enhanced, digitized copy of Jessica's photograph. She was driving a yellow Ford Pinto. He pressed gently. "Would have passed right by here." Edgar glanced at the photo, then quickly away, as if touching a hot surface. "Like I said, don't recall." While Wells continued to engage the old man. "Doctor." Chen stepped outside, her forensic scientist's eyes scanning the property not for what was there, but for what was out of place. The tavern backed up to a dense, dark forest. Behind the main building stood a dilapidated storage shed and an old, windowless garage, both weathered and seemingly untouched for years. As she walked the perimeter, something glinted in the dirt near the edge of the forest, almost completely swallowed by the earth. Kneeling down, she carefully excavated the object with a pen. It was a tarnished metal keyring. Attached to it was a decorative peace symbol charm, popular in the late 70s and early 80s. And on a small, corroded tag, she could just make out two faded, hand-scratched initials, JH. The discovery of the keyring, combined with Edgar's suspicious behavior, was enough. The next day, Wells obtained a search warrant when the team arrived at the tavern. Edgar's composure finally began to crack, his squint tightening as Wells presented the warrant. The search began methodically. "Doctor." Chen's focus was immediate, the old garage. The door was secured with a heavy, rusted padlock that seemed to have been fused shut by time and weather. A pair of bolt cutters made short work of it. The sound of the snapping metal echoed with a shocking finality. As the heavy door groaned open, it revealed a space shrouded in darkness and thick, undisturbed cobwebs. In the center of the garage, cloaked like a body under a shroud, sat a large object covered with a heavy, dust-caked tarp. With a deep breath, Detective Wells and a deputy took a corner of the tarp each. They pulled it back in one smooth, deliberate motion. The air filled with the scent of dust and decay, but underneath it all was a sudden, shocking splash of color, butter yellow. It was a Ford Pinto. The interior was a perfect, horrifying time capsule. The Fleetwood Mac 8 track was still in the player, A macrame purse rested on the passenger seat, and the license plate, coated in a thick layer of grime, was unmistakable JHT 743. It was Jessica Harmon's car, hidden for 38 years, a silent steel mausoleum in a forgotten garage. As deputies led a stunned Edgar Blackwood to a patrol car, his decades of silence finally shattered. His composure crumbled, and a single choked sentence escaped his lips. A confession and a condemnation all in one. "It was Raymond," he cried, his voice breaking with the weight of a secret kept for a lifetime. It was always Raymond. That broken, desperate cry, uttered under the gray Oregon sky, was the key that unlocked a tomb sealed for nearly 4 decades. As Edgar Blackwood was placed into the back of a patrol car, his face a mask of shocked surrender, a new and urgent energy pulsed through the investigation. The Crossroads Tavern was no longer just a dilapidated landmark. It was now the epicenter of a 38-year-old crime scene. Yellow police tape was stretched across the property, a stark, modern barrier against a dark and violent past. The discovery of the Ford Pinto was not an end, but a beginning, the start of a meticulous, almost reverent, process of forensic archaeology. The garage was sealed and treated with the same gravity as an active homicide scene. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, Dr. Chen and her team began their work. The air inside, trapped for decades, was heavy and stale, thick with the scent of dust, decaying upholstery, and time itself. Every surface of the butter yellow car was a potential witness. They photographed it from every angle before the driver's side door was opened with a faint, protesting groan. It was a time capsule, a horrifyingly preserved diorama of a young woman's final hours. The Fleetwood Mac 8-track tape was carefully removed from the player, its magnetic ribbon holding the last songs Jessica Harmon had ever heard. The macrame purse on the passenger seat was gently lifted. Inside, investigators found her wallet, her driver's license bearing the bright, hopeful smile of a recent graduate, and a small collection of quarters, the very coins she had intended to use for a payphone call that was never made. In the trunk, her camping gear remained perfectly packed. A silent, heartbreaking testament to an adventure that had ended before it could begin. Each item was catalogued, bagged, and labeled, not just as evidence, but as relics of a stolen life. With Edgar Blackwood in custody and the car secured, the focus of the search expanded with grim purpose. His initial confession had confirmed their worst fears. But one crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing: Jessica herself, based on Edgar's fractured statements. A section of the property behind the old storage shed was identified as an area of interest. It was a place where a dense stand of pine trees, all roughly the same age, had been planted sometime in the early 1980s, a deliberate, living monument to conceal a grave. The team brought in ground-penetrating radar, a technology that allowed them to see beneath the earth without disturbing it. As the device was rolled across the ground, the operator watched a screen that translated the world below into a language of waves and shadows. And there, in the center of the grove, the radar detected a clear anomaly, a disturbance, a rectangular shape in the soil that did not belong. The excavation began the following morning under a somber, overcast sky. The work was slow and methodical, each layer of soil removed with the care of an archaeological dig. 6 feet down, the shovel struck something soft yet resistant. It was the corner of a blue industrial top, sealed with thick, silvery bands of duct tape that had grown brittle with age. As the team carefully cleared the remaining earth, the full horror of the discovery was revealed. They had found Jessica Harmon, the clothing she wore, described in her mother's initial missing person report, was remarkably preserved, and on the delicate wristbone of her skeletal remains, a tarnished but intact turquoise friendship bracelet still rested. A final, heartbreaking link to the vibrant young woman who had waved goodbye to her mother on that long-ago summer afternoon. The search was over. DNA testing would later provide the scientific certainty. But in that moment, under the silent watch of the pine trees, everyone already knew the truth. In a sterile, windowless interview room at the Pinewood Creek Sheriff's Department, the full story was finally told. Edgar Blackwood, stripped of the tavern, his brother's looming presence, and the secret that had defined his entire adult life, began to talk. Over the course of 8 grueling hours, the entire sordid tale of that July afternoon in 1981 spilled out of him. A torrent of memory and guilt held back for a lifetime, according to Edgar, his voice often breaking into a ragged whisper. Jessica had simply stopped at the tavern to ask if she could use the bathroom. It was a simple, innocent request that sealed her fate. Raymond had been drinking heavily that day, his mood already dark and volatile. He saw her, and in his eyes, she was not a person, but an object of conquest. He attempted to flirt with her, his words slurring, his advances becoming aggressive and unwelcome, when Jessica, unnerved, rebuffed him and tried to leave. Something inside him snapped. "He didn't mean to kill her," Edgar insisted, his eyes pleading, though his own words painted a different, more damning picture. Raymond had these episodes. Ever since he came back from Vietnam, he'd just go somewhere else in his head, and then it would be over, and he'd be calm again, like nothing happened. The assault had been a flash of brutal, unrestrained violence. He struck her repeatedly, his rage absolute and blinding. The attack ended as quickly as it began, leaving Jessica unconscious and bleeding on the tavern's dusty floor, together, under the cover of darkness. The brothers had wrapped her body in the blue tarp. They buried her behind the storage shed, and Raymond, methodical even in his monstrosity, later planted the stand of pine trees over the grave. They had hidden her car in the garage, intending to dispose of it later, to drive it into a lake or abandon it in another state. But they never did. As the initial heat of the investigation cooled, the car became something else. It became a trophy. In the most chilling part of his confession, Edgar revealed the true depth of his brother's depravity. Raymond wouldn't allow the car to be destroyed. It became a private, macabre shrine to his crime. "He'd go out there sometimes," Edgar said, his voice hollow, devoid of all emotion. "Late at night, he'd just sit in the driver's seat. He'd play that Fleetwood Mac tape and drink whiskey, said it helped him remember." For nearly 40 years, the car had sat in that garage, both a piece of evidence they couldn't risk moving and a grotesque memorial that Raymond, the architect of the crime, refused to let go of. When Raymond died of a heart attack in 2016, Edgar had simply continued the charade alone, maintaining the tavern and its terrible secret out of a lifetime of habit and a profound, paralyzing fear. The discovery of Jessica Harmon's remains and the subsequent revelation of her fate sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet borders of Pinewood Creek. The story made national headlines, a horrifying tale of a crime hidden in plain sight. True crime television programs and podcasts dissected the case, and internet sleuths debated the psychology of 2 brothers who had managed to serve drinks to an unsuspecting public for decades, while a young woman's body lay buried just yards away. The town of Pinewood Creek, once known only for its timber and quiet way of life, was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight, its name now synonymous with a dark, long-held secret. The trial of Edgar Blackwood began in February of 2020. The county courthouse, a sleepy building that had seen little significant activity in decades, was transformed into a media circus. Satellite trucks lined the streets, and journalists from Portland and beyond filled the gallery each day, sitting alongside locals who had never forgotten the girl with the yellow Pinto, and newer residents who were learning her story for the first time. The prosecution, led by a determined district attorney, presented a methodical and damning case built on Edgar's own confession and the mountain of physical evidence unearthed by Wells and Chen doctor. Chen herself took the stand, explaining to the jury in clear, concise terms how DNA had confirmed Jessica's identity beyond any shadow of a doubt. Soil analysis from the burial site perfectly matched the soil found in the treads of old work boots recovered from Edgar's apartment above the tavern. Most damning of all was the evidence of premeditation that came to light after Raymond's death. Receipts found in his house showed that the blue tops, one of which had been used to wrap Jessica's body, had been purchased in bulk in 1979, 2 years before her murder. Forestry experts testified that the stand of pine trees planted over the grave had been deliberately positioned to conceal the disturbed ground, their age consistent with the planting in the early 1980s. The defense did not contest the facts of the case. Instead, they argued that Edgar had been a victim himself, coerced by his older, more violent brother. A psychiatrist specializing in codependent and abusive relationships testified about how Edgar's subservient nature might have been manipulated and controlled by Raymond for decades, leaving him unable to break free from his brother's psychological grip, even after his death. But the jury was unconvinced. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts accessory to murder and concealing evidence. Edgar Blackwood, now 81 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that, given his age, amounted to a declaration that he would spend his final years behind bars. As he was led from the courtroom, Edgar looked back once at the gathered spectators, his right eye squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights. He made no statement. He offered no apology. The secrets he and his brother had guarded for a lifetime were finally exposed. But the full, unvarnished truth of what had transpired in the dark heart of Raymond Blackwood had died with him years before. The guilty verdict and the life sentence handed down to Edgar Blackwood were not an end, but a turning point for the community of Pinewood Creek. The trial had lanced a wound that had festered for nearly 4 decades. And now, the painful but necessary process of healing and redefining itself could begin. The most potent symbol of this dark chapter, the Crossroads Tavern, stood empty and silent after Edgar's arrest. The property, seized as evidence, remained in a state of legal limbo for months following the trial. A debate ensued within the community: should it be sold, reopened, forgotten? Ultimately, the county took possession and a decision was made. Some evils are so profound they cannot be repurposed. They must be erased. On a crisp October morning in 2020, a small, quiet crowd gathered at the junction of Highway 27 and the old logging road. They were not there to celebrate, but to bear witness. Heavy excavators, machines of deconstruction and renewal, rumbled into position. As the first steel claw tore into the weathered wooden walls of the tavern, no one cheered. There was only a solemn collective silence, a shared understanding that an entity that had been a cancer on their community was finally being excised. The building came down in a cloud of dust and splintered wood, revealing the dark, empty spaces where unspeakable acts had been planned and concealed. With its demolition, a physical landmark of fear was removed from the landscape forever. In its place, the county established a roadside rest area, but at its heart was a small, beautifully landscaped memorial garden. It was dedicated not only to Jessica Harmon, but to all of Oregon's victims of unsolved crimes. a bronze plaque, anchored in stone, told Jessica's story, acknowledging the decades of pain and the persistence that finally brought the truth to light. The garden was planted with perennial flowers, hardy blooms that would die back in the harsh winter only to return, vibrant and full of life. Each spring a living symbol that no matter how much time passed, life and memory would continue to endure. The final fate of the yellow Ford Pinto was decided with similar solemnity. After being thoroughly processed, it was transported to a scrapyard. Detective Wells had suggested preserving it as a training tool, a monument to the power of preserved evidence. But Sheriff Rodriguez was firm. "Some things don't need to be preserved," she told Wells, as they watched the car being loaded onto a flatbed truck. "Some ghosts should be laid to rest." The car that had served as a secret tomb for decades was crushed into an unrecognizable block of metal, its terrible purpose finally and violently undone. Jessica Harmon was at last laid to rest beside her parents in the Pinewood Creek Cemetery. The funeral, held nearly 40 years after her death, provided a sense of closure that had been cruelly denied to her mother. Hundreds attended, from community members who remembered the case to a new generation who had only just learned her name. Among the mourners were several of Jessica's college friends, now in their 60s, with grown children and lives marked by the passage of the very years their friend had been denied. They shared stories of the vibrant young woman who had dreamed of teaching, and, as a final, poignant tribute, they placed Peace Corps brochures and old National Geographic magazines alongside flowers on her casket, symbols of the dreams she never had the chance to pursue. But the haunting legacy of the Blackwood brothers was far from over. Even with Edgar imprisoned and Raymond dead, a chilling question lingered in the mind of Detective Wells: was Jessica Harmon their only victim? The sheer cold efficiency of the crime suggested a practiced hand. In the spring of 2021, with Edgar's health failing rapidly in prison, Wells made one final attempt to extract the full truth. He visited the State Correctional Facility's infirmary, finding Edgar a frail, withered figure, lost in the white expanse of hospital sheets. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the soft hiss of an oxygen tank were the only sounds in the room. "I'm not here to cause you any more trouble, Edgar," Wells said, his voice low. "But there are other families out there, living with the same uncertainty that Ellen Harmon lived with. They deserve answers too." For several long minutes, Edgar's gaze remained fixed on the ceiling. Finally, he turned his head slightly, his clouded eyes finding Wells. "Raymond had a book," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A ledger, separate from the tavern accounts. Kept it in a metal box, under the floorboards in his bedroom. 3 days later, Edgar Blackwood died in his sleep, taking his own portion of the truth to the grave. But he had left behind a map. Raymond's house had burned down shortly after his death in what was ruled an electrical fire, but now seemed suspiciously convenient. Investigators descended on the charred, skeletal remains of the structure beneath the blackened floor joists of the bedroom. They found it a fireproof metal box, preserved from both the flames and the elements. Inside was a leather-bound ledger. The contents were methodical, meticulous, and monstrous, spanning from April 1979 to November 2003. Each entry included a date, a set of initials, and cryptic notations, references to disposal locations along the logging roads and deep within the national forest. There were 16 sets of initials in total. The fifth entry read, J.H. July 15, 1981. The horrifying truth was finally revealed. Jessica was not the first, nor the last. The Blackwood brothers were not just murderers. They were serial predators who had used their isolated tavern as a hunting ground for 24 years. The Cold Case Unit, with assistance from the FBI, began the painstaking process of matching the initials and dates to missing person reports. By the end of 2022, they had successfully identified 12 of the 16 victims. All were young women, most traveling alone on Highway 27. Some had been reported missing, their cases generating brief flurries of media coverage before going cold. Others had been classified as runaways, their disappearances receiving minimal investigation, following the cryptic map of the ledger. Search teams located their remains, each found wrapped in the brothers' signature blue top, sealed with duct tape. For each victim identified, for each family given the heartbreaking gift of knowing. Detective Wells and Dr. Chen attended the services, standing at a respectful distance, witnesses to the enduring pain of loss and the bittersweet relief of truth. The Blackwood brothers' case became one of the most significant serial killing investigations in Oregon history, not for the sheer number of victims, but for the horrifying duration of their activity and the length of time they had evaded justice. The Pinewood Creek Sheriff's Department's Cold Case Unit, initially a temporary project, was established as a permanent, well-funded division. And in its entrance hallway, a plaque was installed featuring a quote, taken from one of Ellen Harmon's many letters to the department over the years. Time doesn't erase the truth. It only hides it until someone cares enough to look. Her daughter's legacy, once defined only by her absence, was redefined by her dreams. The Jessica Harmon Memorial Scholarship was established at Portland State University, funded by community donations to provide financial assistance to students pursuing degrees in education, especially those who plan to work in underserved communities or join the Peace Corps. A new generation of teachers would now go out into the world and fulfill the promise that Jessica herself had been denied. Detective Wells continued to lead the cold case unit until his retirement, resolving more than a dozen other cold cases. Dr. Chen became the director of the State Forensic Laboratory, implementing innovative programs based on the lessons learned from the Harmon investigation. The site where the Crossroads Tavern once stood is now a place of remembrance rather than horror. The memorial garden blooms each spring, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the darkness that once occupied that very spot. The story of the Harmon case is now taught in local schools, not just as a cautionary tale, but as an example of how justice, though delayed, can eventually prevail through persistence and science. And in the end, it was not just technology that solved this case. It was the careful preservation of evidence from 1981, the hairbrush, the fingerprint cards, the witness statements typed and filed away that allowed 21st-century techniques to finally unlock the truth. The past and the present worked together, just as Ellen Harmon had always believed they would. The Blackwood brothers had counted on indifference. They had counted on people forgetting, on evidence degrading, on witnesses moving away. They had nearly succeeded. But they hadn't counted on the persistence of a mother's love, the preservation of a few crucial clues, or the dedication of investigators who refused to let the dust of time conceal the truth forever. They hadn't counted on someone, 40 years later, caring enough to look. The truth, no matter how long it is buried or how deep the grave, will always wait patiently for its chance to come to light.